society has these intense ageist, ideas about elderly people, that they're not worthwhile and that they don't have anything to offer. And when he realized that this was such a prevalent thing in society, he hadn't really thought about it before. And not only that he had kind of internalized these ideas, which is what happens with all these, horrible isms that still have in our society.
This is a show where we'll explore what it means to retire with purpose.
To make a difference, to invest in your family, your community, to live to your full potential and explore abundant opportunities to live with purpose and community.
From Garden Spot Communities in New Holland, Pennsylvania, welcome to
Purpose in Retirement.
Hello, I'm Scott Miller, the Chief Marketing Officer at Garden Spot Communities.
And I'm Juanita Fox, the storyteller.
In this season of Purpose in Retirement, we're exploring the envisioned future of Garden Spot Communities. We're leaning into sparking a pro-aging revolution. So we're talking with authors and writers, social media influencers who are using their voices to raise awareness of ageism in our culture and around the world.
In today's episode, we chat with Rob Schwartz, the son of Maury Schwartz.
Maury became popular in the late 1990s. A former student published his memoir entitled Tuesdays with Maury. The book was an instant hit. The movie was produced in 1999.
Years later, Rob was working in his dad's office. He found a manuscript of a book his father wrote prior to being diagnosed with ALS. Rob will explain how he and his mom edited the manuscript and pitched it for publication.
The result is The Wisdom of Maury, a book full of worthwhile guidance and wisdom for living your best life regardless of your age.
We'll talk with Rob in a moment.
Rob, hey, thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Tuesdays with Maury came out in the 1990s. It was very popular. There was a major motion film that was made as a result of that. A lot of people saw that, and then you turned around and had this relationship with your father and published this book, The Wisdom with Maury. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And so, just sort of curious, tell us, what was the story behind The Wisdom of Maury?
Right. It's a pretty strange story, one elongated over a very long span of time. And to tell the story properly, we have to go back to when my father was writing this book, which was between 1988 or 1989 and 1992. So he wrote this book a very long time ago. And it just so happened that I was a young kid at this time. I had just graduated from college and I went on a big trip around Asia at that time. And I came back to the United States to our house in Newton, Massachusetts in 1989, in the summer of 1989. And my father was writing this book. And that just happened to be the last time that I lived under the same roof as my parents, certainly as my dad, for any extended period of time. And it was also coincided with the time that he was writing this book. So I talked to him a lot about the book and what he was trying to do and how he was writing it and what his ideas were. I mean, it was really serendipitous because after that, shortly after the end of that time that I lived at home, which was 3 months, I moved to Japan and I was very far away and I never lived at home again under their roof. And then, of course, as people will know, when he finished writing this book and was hoping to get it published, then he got ill. And that part of the story is very famous. He developed ALS and he started suffering from it. And he started talking about what it meant to, what was the meaning of life and what was important and what is it like when you face your own mortality. And he got a lot of interest, as people know. He appeared on Nightline with Ted Koppel, and his old student, Mitch Albom, came back. And from those meetings, we got Tuesdays with Maury, which became this incredible international success. But the point is that I discussed with my dad how and why he was writing this book and, what he wanted to communicate. But he got ill after he finished it. And to be clear, some people have not been clear on this. This book, the meat of this book is 100% my dad. He wrote it from the first word till the last word. It's not me. I add an essay at the beginning and the essay at the end, and those are very clearly separate. but my father wrote the entire book. Some reviewers have made mistakes, like I put this book together from my father's notes or something like that. That's completely incorrect. He wrote this manuscript as a book, which he wanted to publish from the first word to the last word. And he got ill and wasn't able to publish it. And then, as people know, he passed away. And I was living in Japan. I used to come back and forth between the US and Tokyo, where I was living, and I was a journalist in Tokyo. So I would be writing all sorts of pieces and faxing them back to Japan back in the day when we used faxes. And yeah, before we had standard email, though this story bleeds into when we had email. So I would be emailing my stories back to my editors by the time that we hit the second stage of this story. And the second stage of this story is I used to write in my father's office, because my mother had kept it just like he had it in his professional life, which was a great comfort to me, actually. All of his pictures, all of his books were there, all of these loving mementos from his students. And he was absolutely a beloved professor of sociology at Brandeis University. And we can talk about that aspect of it if you like, because he absolutely adored teaching. He adored his students, and they really adored him. I mean, it's not an exaggeration, which is what Mitch describes in Tuesdays with Morrie. If you read it, he describes that Morrie was his favorite professor, and they had lots and lots of, heart-to-heart conversations. It was like that with lots of students from my dad. So the second part of this story is I was sitting in his office writing some journalistic, piece, some article, and I pulled open a desk drawer, and in there I saw this huge, bigger than B, what do we call it? Letter size, I guess we call it here, size bound manuscript with this big black cover. I still have it. And I was like, what is this? And I flipped it open. And as soon as I saw what was inside, I knew exactly what it was, because I had talked to my dad when he was writing this book. This was the book that my father had written. This is more than 10 years later, and easily 8 years, let's say, after he passed away. So my father has been gone for a long time, and I rediscovered the manuscript, and I decided that I have to do something with this manuscript. I have to get this manuscript published, because my father was really intent on doing that. And, he, in a sense, ran out of time. He wasn't ill when he was writing this manuscript. This manuscript is about aging and remaining vibrant and engaged with life and engaged with society while you age. It's not about being ill at all. I mean, he has little sections about health and that sort of thing, but he wasn't ill. He wasn't particularly ill when he wrote this book. So that's the story of how I discovered the manuscript and how I decided to publish it. There's the journey of actually getting it published is a long journey as well.
What were some of the challenges you faced in getting it published?
It's more of a journey than I would say the challenges, but my mother was very much involved in me publishing this book. But what was unknown was that my mother was essential in editing all of my father's academic work, which we can also talk about, which was extremely well received in his time as an academic. In fact, he wrote a book which was like a watershed in social psychology. Now we're going way back into my father's career. But the point is that my mother had edited that, as well as other books that he had written. So she was very familiar with his writing style and how he expressed himself and how he was best edited. So she helped me edit it. And we had long discussions about how to do this. And you have to remember, at the time, I was living in Japan. I had a very active, by the time I really got into editing this book, I had a very active journalism career. I had two positions. One was at the national broadcaster in Japan, which is called NHK. I was an editor in their news department. And I was also the Billboard magazine, the famous music magazine, music business magazine. I was their person in Asia. So I was covering all of Asia for Billboard. So I had two positions, both of which were very active. So it took me a long time to find the time to sit down and carefully edit the book and then go through it with external editors. And the whole publishing process, as some of you may know, is quite arduous. You have to find an agent, and then it has to be the right agent, and then they have to find the right publishing house. It has to be the right fit in all of those relationships.
So Deepak Chopra is quoted on the cover. It says, "Beautiful. Those lucky enough to read this book will be inspired." And I read it over a weekend, and I was inspired. Couldn't put it down, right? And so, It also, and I think we talked about this too, that it felt like it fit right into what Garden Spot Communities is all about. What has been the impact on your readers or people who've read the book? Have they talked to you about what the impact was on their lives?
I've gotten some feedback like that, but generally, when I talk to people, I'm introducing the book to them. But some people have talked about the impact on their lives. And I think that I think it's really impressive that you sat down and read this book over a weekend, because I think that there's a lot in there. My father obviously packed a lot into this book, and it's clearly written in the way, and I think you'll understand this, of the kind of book where you put in Post-it notes, or you write notes in the corner, or you have your own journal, because it's really asking a lot of questions and asking the reader to, bring their personal experiences and how they feel to the book and to the things that my dad is presenting. And of course, that very much relates to how he was as a teacher as well at Brandeis. I would hope, and I think, that the impact of this book is really to encourage people over a certain age, and whatever age that is. I mean, I think my father did envision 55 as the age where, whatever, you start to be aging, or whatever, whatever phrase you like to use, senior. I think in our society today, 55, is the new whatever, 35 or whatever people like to say. So whatever the cutoff is, it doesn't matter, whatever you consider aging. My father was aiming this book at people like that, to try and combat, and I know you guys are very familiar with this, the ageism that exists in our society, and this ridiculous notion that after you reach a certain age, you don't really have any value to society or to people anymore. You should just go and sit in the corner and do nothing until, the end of your days, which is completely ridiculous. And my father was so appalled by this idea that that's what motivated him to write this book, and to try and encourage people and show them, not just say it, but show them so many different ways of living and thinking about things, and so many different ways of being encouraged. So this book, as Juanita will know, is full of stories and poetry and newspaper clippings and all these different medium that all express the same thing, that basically you can do what you want at any age, as long as you put your mind to it, and as long as you have a positive attitude about it. And of course, people have limitations, and my father talks about the limitations. People have physical limitations, people have all kinds of different kinds of limitations, but you shouldn't just stop there and say, oh, well, I have this limitation. Even young people have limitations, right? There's all sorts of things out there in the world, but he says that shouldn't stop you. You can do whatever you want to do. And there's tons of stories I like to tell from this book, tons of newspaper clippings he uses. One of the ones I love to present is he tells the story of the 95-year-old man who has just graduated from university and plans to become a doctor. That's the kicker. He's 95. He's planning to go to medical school, So the point is not whether or not he becomes a doctor. The point is that you can do whatever you want to do at any age. And I think that is what has impact in this book, and really what my father was aiming for when he wrote this book. I usually tell the story of my dad's journey to creating this book as well, which is of course different than my journey. I talked to my father while he was writing it, but there was a very specific motivation in my father's life and a specific set of circumstances which led him to writing this book, and I'll explain it to you now. So my dad was a professor of sociology at Brandeis University, as I explained, and he loved teaching. As I said, he loved teaching, he loved dealing with students. So all of these people in his life were between 18 and 22 years old, or of course he had graduate students too. So maybe they were in their mid-20s or even late 20s, but everybody in his life was very, very young relative to him. And he was a professor for 40 years. So he never viewed himself as someone who was elderly or someone who was aging. That's just not the self-image that he had. He was a super vivacious person. He used to run around and do all sorts of things, have a very active social life in addition to teaching all of his classes and doing research and publishing and all of these different things.
Oh, wow.
And at age 65, and this is way back in the 80s now, my father has been gone for a long time. At age 65, the university came to him and said, "Oh, why don't you think about retiring?" And he was, shocked and said, "No, thank you." And at 68, the university came to him again when he was 68 and said, "Hey, why don't you think about retiring?" And he's again said, "No, thank you." And when he turned 70, the university said, "You need to retire."
Oh,
they
wow.
forced him to retire. That doesn't exist today, as you guys are probably well familiar. Professors can stay on as long as they're capable of teaching nowadays. But in my father's day, they forced him to retire at 70. And of course, this was a huge shock to him. He never viewed himself as someone who was elderly or less capable or something like that. And when he thought about it, it made him very uncomfortable that he was viewed that way by other people. And being a social psychologist and somebody who actually did a lot of therapy himself, he investigated within himself, why do I feel uncomfortable about being viewed that way? And he figured out the reason why he felt uncomfortable was because society has these intense ageist ideas about elderly people, that they're not worthwhile and that they don't have anything to offer. And when he realized that this was such a prevalent thing in society, he hadn't really thought about it before. And not only that, that he had kind of internalized these ideas, which is what happens with all these, horrible isms that we have or had or still have in our society, like racism and sexism. You internalize it, and then you have this, horrible image of yourself. That's the fundamental problem, right? Or it's half of the problem, let's say. So when he realized that he had to combat ageism within himself, and he wanted to combat it within society. And that was the motivation for him to write this book, to be that this ageist, idea that we have very strongly in American society, much more so than other societies in the world, that this needs to be excised and gotten rid of. And we need to become a society which honors all people, whatever age they are, whatever race they are, whatever color they are, whatever ethnic background they are. And hopefully we're moving towards a society that's like that.
Sometimes we'll say is that we come across people or works like this that have a common soul as we do. And I think that's kind of like, I feel that same sort of a thing right now. We're right on track with everything that you were talking about. When I was looking at the book, I was going back through it a little bit. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, and I remember when I was listening to this, and the book I was listening to it, there are these like several pages about hope and despair. And the thing that I loved about that, and you just sort of hit on it, which is society tells us these things, and then we internalize it and we believe it, and we have to get over it ourselves, right? And so I was just looking at that whole section again on hope and despair, and it fits right into what you were talking about. So I'm curious, like, what would you say is the essence of the wisdom of the book?
Break it into two halves. And before I do that, I just want to comment that I think that the hope and despair section is a great snippet of the book to give an example of what it is. And my father also has a section on regret, which is very similar. So the idea that, the book is all peaches and cream and you can do whatever you want and there's no barriers, it's not like that at all. He talks about real things and real psychological issues and real barriers, both in society and in people's minds. And, real things in our lives like regret and despair that, really affect people and bring them down. And he offers strategies and ways to think about things. To circle back to your question, I think that the gist of his book is there's two sides to it. And one I sort of already talked about, where my father is trying to create an atmosphere where your age is not going to define what you do. or what you can be or what you can achieve or anything, right? Your age is not really going to define anything about you other than, possibly your physical limitations or whatever. But the point is that he's trying to show people that this world is possible. And that's why he has all these stories and poetry and all sorts of things in this book that are trying to create that atmosphere and trying to combat this ageist idea. So much so that he creates his own word, right? We're still in the first half of what I want to say is the essence of this book. He creates his own word, which Juanita may or may not remember, which was age casting, right? This word, this coinage of his is based on typecasting in film, where an actor is forced to play just one type of role, right? They're typecast. They can only play the bad guy, or they can only play the, ditzy blonde or something like that. Right. And he thought if we could identify that specific thing in our society and put a word to it, which he called age casting, we can just start to combat it. So that's half the book. And then the other half of the book, I mean, certainly there's all kinds of analysis of these things like hope and despair and regret, but there's a lot of advice in the book, or ideas, I like to say, suggestions on how to live and how to approach life. Some are very specific, like try this, and some are more, this is how to approach life, or this is what you should think about in terms of, making your life more meaningful or more vibrant or something like this. And I can enumerate those things like A, B, C, D, E, if you like. I like people to find them for themselves in the book, but I can do it. So I would say that there's two halves to the book, and, obviously they fit together, but those are the two things that my father's aiming for with this book.
I alluded earlier that the envisioned future for Guardian Spot community is to spark a pro-aging revolution, right? And so we are looking for partners who are already doing this. And it feels like your father was doing this 30 years ago, right? He was thinking about the fact that there's ageism and we're putting people into boxes. Probably came to mind from his experience with the university, right? Like, he didn't think that he was a certain age and needed to retire. One of the things that we would like to do is that spark a pro-aging revolution. How do you believe that this book, The Wisdom of Maury, and the work that he's written and the work that you're doing on behalf of him, how do you believe that that's helping to combat ageism?
Yeah, it's fantastic. The work you're doing is fantastic. And I mean, I don't know how to say it more strongly. What you're doing and the message of this book fit together, hand in glove. I mean, they're exactly the same. My father didn't call it a pro-aging revolution, but if you had said that to him, I'm sure that he would have been absolutely overjoyed. I mean, that's essentially what he's aiming for in this book, is to erase these horrible ageist, oppressive ideas that are put on people, have people over a certain age, whatever you want to call it, aging, senior, more integrated into society, more accepted in the workplace, their wisdom and experience more honored in our society. And that it's American society that has real problem with this. Other societies, particularly in Asia, but even in Europe, are much more integrated. You were talking about it, how segregated we are age-wise nowadays, how different it was 100 years ago. It was also different everywhere else in the world 100 years ago. And those societies are still more age integrated than the US is. Not that there's necessarily so great about it. I think that there's plenty of other societies in the world that are similar to the US, where after a certain age, you're not, supposed to be in a professional position or what have you. But to circle back to your question, I think the two things fit together perfectly. And my father is showing people, is giving examples and giving stories and giving ideas about what that world that you're talking about looks like. I think that it's basically, we're doing exactly the same thing. I don't know how to say it more strongly.
And I think that one of the cool things is like you have this, you're doing this, we're doing this. Our podcast this time is talking to other people that are doing this, and so there's this beginning of a groundswell that hopefully is going to result in some sort of major changes. I mean, that's what we can hope for. And I'm curious, if you sort of look out 5, 10, 15 years, what would you hope the impact of all of this is?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we would have a more age integrated society where everyone is judged, on their abilities and their creativity that they bring to any project or any situation, and that we would have a less youth dominated culture, and that's the way that that the United States is right now. We could talk about why it is. The United States has been the worldwide leader in entertainment, if you like to call it that, via Hollywood and via all those things, and it's always so youth oriented in terms of sexuality, in terms of whatever, even action or violence and all that sort of thing. Lots of things that we don't particularly love in entertainment, but it has certainly dominated the atmosphere of the culture, and hopefully we can change that.
Is there anything that you're personally doing beyond the book to make people aware of ageism?
Ooh, that's a good question, because I have a lot of different projects, some of which are more, socially conscious, and some of which are not completely socially conscious. I think in terms of ageism, this is my major thing. Of course, I released this book in 2023, and I did a huge amount of tours and speaking and, newspapers. There was even a lot of television coverage of the book when it came out. So it's been kind of a full-time job to promote the book. But I think that, this is my avenue, I think, to combat ageism, because my father had such a big reputation because of Tuesdays with Morrie, and people know who he is. As you know, in American society, you have to have a reason for people to pay attention to you because you have a good idea or something interesting to say, right? You need to have some kind of hook. And my father is well known, thanks to Mitch and his wonderful book. And Mitch is constantly out there. Mitch has a podcast, Tuesday People, where he uses recordings of my dad that he made about some topic, and then he, with his other producers, sit there and talk about it for a while, which is fantastic. So, he's continuing to put my dad's wisdom out there. And a lot of what my father has to say, even in Tuesdays with Morrie and Mitch, is perfectly integrated into this.
Yeah. Well, I think we could probably talk for hours. But I was just curious, as we sort of come to the conclusion here, are there some things that you would like to say to our listeners?
One thing that I would say, and I think people can relate to this, I feel like this book and Tuesdays with Morrie, which was such a huge success and sold so many copies, it's in so many different languages, are like bookends. And the reason that I say that is my father is talking about the same thing in both of the books. But it's very ironic that one of them was published a long time ago, one of them was just published, but the one that was just published was actually written before the one that was published a long time ago. And the styles of the two books is completely different. Mitch, as opposite as you can be, Mitch wrote Tuesdays with Morrie in this incredibly succinct, direct, all the sentences are extremely short. There's not a single word in that book that you're going to have to look up in the dictionary, right? He wrote it that way on purpose. My father was a professor of sociology, he analyzes things, his sentences are longer, he has much, he's much more into digging into things and really going through them, and he has lists of things and suggestions. It's just a much more filled out version of the same ideas. So I think it's wonderful. The two books really fit together in a way that is really special. If you read them both, you'll understand what I mean. The meanings are similar, but the way they're expressed and the kind of expression is extremely different. So that's why I encourage people, especially if they like Tuesdays with Morrie, to get this book and think about what my dad is saying, and write notes to yourself and reread it. And as you guys pointed out in the beginning, there's lots of difficult things that are addressed in the book. It's not all just like, oh, this is so easy, just go off and live a great life. It's not like that at all. There's lots of stuff in our life that is tough. Despair, he talks about physical limitations. He talks about illness. He talks about regret. As I said, the chapter on regret always sticks in my mind because we all have regrets. These people who come up and say, oh, I have no regrets in life. To me, it's like, okay, you're not being honest with yourself, or you're not very perceptive. If you really have no regrets in life, you executed everything perfectly in your entire life. You're not a human being, you're a robot then, It's like we are imperfect beings. We make mistakes all the time. And as caring people, we always have regret. And what do you do with that regret? My father analyzes that in this book. He discusses, what do you do with it? How can you use that in a positive way? Not to disregard it, but to try and change it into something positive. That's the kind of thoughts that are in this book, and I think that are extremely valuable for people across the age spectrum, but particularly for people over X age, wherever you want to put that age, 55, 60, 65, wherever you want to put it.
The Wisdom of Morrie includes so many inspirational stories. Rob really just touched on a few. While Morrie wrote the manuscript for people who were 60 and older, the wisdom applies at any age.
It really does. You know, Rob referenced Morrie's use of the word age casting. Age casting stereotypes our culture. It makes us think things like young people do this, old people do that. He was really ahead of his time. I mean, he wrote this almost 40 years ago. But it's finally gaining recognition through the deconstruction of ageism. As baby boomers age, Garden Spot is eager to participate.
The PDF for this episode is entitled 5 Pieces of Wisdom from Morrie and explores a list he includes in the book that reflects on the benefits of aging well. You'll need to download it to discover these pieces of wisdom, or purchase the book and discover the wisdom for yourself. You can find a link to Rob's webpage, wisdomofmorrie.com, in the podcast description. Scott, before we go, let's not forget the giveaway.
Ah, yes, and you can contact us through our website, gardenspotcommunities.org. Mention the podcast before December 31st, 2024, and we'll enter you into a drawing for a hot air balloon ride for 2. Thank you for listening to Purpose in Retirement. I'm Scott Miller.
And I'm Juanita Fox. A special thanks to Rob Schwartz for joining us for this podcast. On our next podcast, we'll talk with Nancy Peckenham, a former executive producer for CNN who started an online writing community called Crowsfeed. Our senior producer and host is Scott Miller.
Our co-host is Juanita Fox. Our audio engineer is Tyler Noss, and our producer is Sharon Sparks.